Welcome back to Narrative Dive, where we are deep diving into the stories dominating our world. Today, joining me is Amanda Knox. Amanda is an exoneree, journalist, public speaker, author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Waiting to be Heard, and co-host with her partner, Christopher Robinson, of the podcast Labyrinths. Her second book, Free, My Search for Meaning, came out March 25th, 2025, and is already having immense impact. Between 2007 and 2015, Amanda spent nearly 4 years in an Italian prison and 8 years on trial for a murder that she did not commit. She has since become an advocate for criminal justice reform and media ethics. She sits on the advisory council for the Frederick Douglass Project for Justice, serves as an Innocence Network ambassador, and is on the Innocence Center Board of Directors. She is the recipient of the 2024 Innocence Network Impact Award. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much.
And I have to mention to our listeners that the discussion that we're about to have is a continuation of a panel discussion on image-based sexual abuse that was hosted by the NGO Falco at the 69th session of the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women in March 2025. So that was last month, the same month that your book came out, which I think is amazing. Our panel included two former Narrative Dive guests, Andrea Powell and Susanna Gibson, who spoke about the adversarial uses of explicit images in an attempt to silence powerful women and to cause them reputational harm and degradation. So today, Amanda and I will be discussing how media can create and spread adversarial narratives in the context of criminal cases, and also her profound healing journey with everything she has gone through in that context. So I'm very excited to be talking to you, and I'm familiar with your story and had been following it for many years, having been on the front lines of how women are treated in media and a journalist myself. But for those listening, if you could kind of give an overview of the events, if they're unfamiliar with what happened to you in the past, beginning in 2007 and for many years beyond, especially the media controversy that you were thrust into.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, what I went through was between 2007 and 2015, I was on trial for murder. And this resulted because of I was studying abroad in Perugia, Italy, and one of my roommates was murdered by a burglar who broke into our home. And police initially made a judgment that things were not as it seemed, that actually the break-in was staged and that someone in the house was involved in the murder, and they assumed it was me. And so they put me through 53 hours of interrogation over 5 days, eventually got me to sign some statements implicating myself and others in the crime that were obtained violating my human rights. I was denied a right to attorney. It was an overnight interrogation. It was coercion. And even though I retracted those statements the very same day, I was brought to prison alongside my boyfriend and my boss at the time. And very shortly thereafter, DNA from the crime scene revealed who actually had committed the crime, this local burglar. But instead of the police admitting that they had initially veered in the wrong direction, they just squished all these people together into one narrative. And the narrative was a murder orgy that I had orchestrated a murder orgy and had these two young men who had no relationship to each other, did not know each other, join me in, sexually assaulting my roommate and then holding her down so I could stab her to death. That was the narrative. And it was based on zero evidence whatsoever. However, it was a narrative that really took hold. And this is a really great thing to talk about for this panel discussion as an extension of it, because of the image that was presented of me in lieu of, actual evidence, implicating me in this crime. Instead, there was a campaign of character assassination that was perpetrated not just by the prosecution in this case, but also in the wider world of the media, because the media saw an opportunity to make a lot of money off of what was a very pornographic scandal, and very much positioning the two young women who were directly involved, Meredith, my roommate, and me, the accused, and positioning us as like opposites on this dichotomy of women. So there's the slut, and then there's the virgin, there's, the free-spirited, drug-addled, whore, and there's the judgmental, uptight virgin, and really pitting us against each other as women. And so it speaks to, again, how we use, what kinds of narratives we use to villainize women, and how those are accompanied by imagery that sort of tells that story, even though it's imagery that is potentially taken out of context. A great example of this, there's, I think, the most famous image from the trial is a 3-second video clip that was just used over and over and over again in the media to illustrate me as an unfeeling, sexually depraved monster. And this image was just right outside of the crime scene, immediately after discovering Meredith's body. I was there with my boyfriend and another one of my roommates. We had called the police because we realized our house was broken into. We discovered Meredith's body, and I'm standing outside of the house. All of these television cameras and photographers are already there capturing images. And at a certain point, my boyfriend is consoling me. I'm just sort of standing there in shock and overwhelmed. Everyone's yelling in Italian, but he consoles me, and then he leans in and kisses me. He gives me like 2 or 3 little chaste kisses on the mouth, just as like a reassuring kind of thing.
I remember that footage. Yes.
Yes. But this is the footage that was
Mhm.
then captured and broadcast over and over again in slow-mo on repeat in order to present me as a sexually depraved, woman-hating monster. What person would ever, make out with somebody outside of a crime scene? And it was very much used to, again, present me as this character, a woman who is capable of committing a man's crime.
I do remember seeing the one about the sex orgy, and then also there was talk of satanic rituals. I mean, it's almost like that middle school game Telephone, where you go around in a circle and someone whispers something like, "My brother bought a chair," and then it just gets blown out of proportions in the end. So I do remember seeing some of these narratives about you in the media, and the term Foxy Knoxy especially
Yeah.
started circulating, and it was that image of you having been arrested and the image of you and your boyfriend. This is so common with women having false narratives spun about them, especially revealing private details of their lives
Mm.
and other adversarial tactics. Why do you think media turns on women so readily, spinning these false narratives? What makes us such a target for this?
That's a really great question, because it requires that I sort of get into the mind of the person who
Yeah.
who perpetrates this. I do think that there is a so first of all, let's identify what it is. So there's this tendency to vilify women, particularly through our sexuality, and to diminish us as figures who have something valuable to say or some valuable contribution to give. I think that the reason why that works is that somehow, if you can argue that a woman in particular, is sexually devious in some way, it delegitimizes them. And I think that works more on women than it does on men, because there is just a natural interest in women as sexual objects. And so it tends to capture people's attention. And as a result of that, it tends to, you get bang for your buck, right? Like if you accuse a woman of a financial crime, it's not going to be as exciting to the audience as accusing a woman of a sexual crime, right? Just because she is a sexual object in people's minds. So I think that's one reason why women are attacked in this way is because it just captures people's attention. And I think that women are more easily sort of put into a little box. Like our sexuality tends to, in a lot of people's minds, define us as human beings, as opposed to just being one aspect of ourselves. In light of the fact that in a lot of people's minds, we are ultimately objects of sexual desire, and more so than we are contributing members of society. And so I think that when women are a threat, that I think it is the easiest path in order to knock out a woman and her capabilities and instead diminish her. And in my own case, I think that it was the easiest way for the prosecution to push forward a narrative of guilt because they didn't actually have evidence to back up that narrative
Exactly.
of guilt. So it was really, again, the narrative that they want to push is one of, either this woman is not legitimate or this woman is guilty. And how do we do that? Well, we don't do that by talking about the facts and the figures. We talk about that through character assassination. And the best way to assassinate a woman's character is through her sexuality.
Absolutely. Yep.
Real or imagined, by the way, because
I was just going to say that. I was like,
Yes.
sometimes it's completely a figma, like you've said in some of your interviews before. And one of the harder questions around that topic is, how do we combat this tendency? How do we re-steer this? Can we, in many ways? Because it's hard to control what people will invent, right?
Right. Yeah, and this is there's two sides to this question. So one is, as the vilified woman, how does one go about doing that? And then the other side of the equation is, those of us who are consuming these narratives, how do we go about sort of rejecting rejecting what is placed before us? And I think the more easy question to answer is the one when it talks about just all of us in general who are hearing these stories come our way. Do we casually absorb what is being given to us, or do we intellectually interrogate what is being pitched, what is being sold, what is the product being sold to us, and is that
Exactly.
product valid? Is it good? Is it doing something for me? Is it in my interest? Or is it really just cannibalizing the worst impulses of humanity? And I think that understanding, sort of having a critical eye as to what is being presented to you, instead of just being sort of fed intellectual junk food and consuming it with abandon, I think is the first step. Is just like taking one step back and having a critical eye on, is this being force fed to me, and to what end? Do I really believe this, or is this even relevant? Like, one of the questions that I was always talking about in my trial is like, why are we all talking about my sex life? Like, there's no DNA of me at the crime scene. So why are we discussing my sex life? It is irrelevant. Like, let's go back to the facts. So I think, as consumers of media, we should really be interrogating to ourselves what is actually in our public interest versus what is meant to be stimulating some impulse that we have, and yet is actually is a smoke screen for what is really important, and what is being hidden from us because we are being pitched this woman's sexual whatever, this narrative. As far as women, and especially women who have been targeted or vilified in this way, I think that is a much more difficult question. Because if there's one thing that I learned about, my experience going through the criminal justice system, it's that it's not really about facts. It's about story. And it's not necessarily the most truthful story that wins, but the most compelling one, the one that titillates the jurors' minds, the ones that like plants a seed in the minds of the juror and stimulates them on a deep level such that they can't ignore it. And again, it's a dangerous reality that character assassination of women through their sexuality is a sticky, sticky narrative. And so how do you combat something that is sticking in the minds of people, beyond their conscious reasoning? Like
Exactly.
you can throw facts and figures and rational arguments at people all you want, and the conscious mind is still going to be exploited or controlled by the unconscious. And I think that as women, we have to think about a different narrative that is more compelling and more sticky than the shamed and vilified sexual woman narrative, and really take ownership of ourselves, and having been vilified in this way as part of our story. And so when I think about it as for myself, for instance, I know that I will never be able to go back to being anonymous college student, right? Like, I am forever going to be the girl accused of orchestrating a murder orgy. And and I'm forever going to be viewed in as someone who has been vilified for my sexuality. And that gives you pause, right? You cannot engage in the world in a way the same way. I didn't get to go on Tinder back when I was,
Not
dating or
missing
anything.
anything.
I
Yeah.
know I'm not missing anything, but like in the way that you feel like you cannot just be casually exploring who you are as a person in the world, like you have to, like, I think one of the really tough things about being women is that we always, always, always have to be graceful, no matter what we've been through. And I think that as women, we can support each other even when we are not graceful. Because I think one of the responses to being vilified in this way is existential crisis. Everything that you thought you could count on is pulled out from underneath you. It isn't just your beliefs or your work that is being called into question, but your very self, and in the most intimate and personal way. And in the aftermath of that kind of trauma, or in the midst of that trauma, you flail. The ground
Yes.
has been pulled out from underneath you, and you're trying to grasp at anything that is going to give you a sense of control back in your life. And sometimes we grasp at the wrong things, or we stand up for ourselves in an ungraceful way, and it comes across as, shrill, or, whatever it is. Like, there are all these words that we use to diminish and undervalue the experiences of women. And so I think the the big thing that a person who is going through it can do is to take a step back, take stock, try not, as hard as it is, try not to take it personally, because it's not actually personal. It's them just attacking, like, it's the low-hanging fruit of attacking a woman is attacking her through her sexuality, and then calling a spade a spade. Like, arriving with a narrative that says, "Oh, here are some people who are trying to who are selling a product to you, which is a lie. And they're doing it because they don't want you to notice what's on the other side of their smokescreen, which is nonsense, which is fear, which is inadequacy, all of these things. That's the only reason why they're selling this lie to you about me." And so arriving not from a place of defensiveness, but from a place of strength, and recognizing that it is not personal. Um,
That's very powerful,
yeah.
everything you just said. And that's absolutely true. In a smokescreen is great for when someone doesn't have facts. But I have a friend who's a pilot who says facts aren't always the most compelling thing, because when the media talks about smoke on a plane or a plane crash or
hmm
a projection of a plane crash, no one looks at the statistics and says flying is actually the safest mode of transportation. And this
Right.
is really so rare. It's just this is dramatic and scary, and so now I'm attached to it, and it stokes fear in me,
Right.
on the emotional side, definitely.
Absolutely. And again, like that, what that suggests, and I 100% agree. And I think that in response, to that kind of thing, you have to you again take stock and recognize what is your position of strength. What is a story? What is there a narrative that can actually be more compelling than the scary plane going down image, And it's tough because, like I said, this idea of women hating women, women being sexually depraved, those are very, very sticky and like deeply rooted narratives, and there's a reason why they persist throughout human history. Um, and so challenging those narratives is not just about calling them out for being false. It's about arriving to the table with an even more compelling narrative.
Absolutely. At that note, I want to go to your books because I found it interesting. Your second book, Free My Search for Meaning, which just came out last month, you described it as what you have done about what happened to you, while describing your first book, Waiting to Be Heard, as the story of what happened to you. So
Right.
there's like part one and part two.
Yeah.
And it's almost like clearing the air and speaking in my own authentic voice. And then here's all of the impact I've had from this.
Right.
Why is having both of those perspectives in telling an authentic story to the world after everything and you've endured so critical?
Yes. Well, I think the best way of saying it in a nutshell is Waiting to Be Heard was not really my story. It was a story of something that happened to me. Other people, made decisions and took actions that had an effect on me, but I was really without agency. And so, somebody broke into my home and raped and murdered my roommate, and then police officers went after the wrong people. Those are the people who have agency in the story, and Waiting to Be Heard was the purpose of that story was to, you know, I think for the most part was to talk about what it was like to have gone through that experience, but also to just try to combat some misinformation about me that had been, out there in the media for so long. And so it was really just adding my voice to this chorus of voices who were authoring my experience. It was, a story of like, oh my God, WTF, like that happened. Free My Search for Meaning is when it starts becoming my story. It's when it starts becoming me making decisions about my own life in light of the fact that I have gone through this experience. And part of that story, it's a story about that's not just what happened, but so what and now what? Those are the kinds of questions that I ask myself as a person who has experienced deep and overwhelming trauma that have lasting impacts, which I think makes it a more universal story because I feel like everyone in their life has something bad happen to them at some point that becomes really life-defining, and they have to pick themselves up, gather the pieces of their life together and try to reconfigure it in a way that makes sense, that isn't debilitating, that isn't just a victim narrative that leaves you feeling broken and at odds with the universe. And instead, how do you feel propelled forward and empowered by the experience that you've gone through? And a huge goal of mine in the writing of Free My Search for Meaning was to, first of all, talk about the ways that I failed to find meaning. Again, that sort of once you've had the rug pulled out from underneath you, you start falling, you start flailing, you start grasping at things that you think will give you connection and give you a sense of meaning and give you a sense of purpose. And some of those things are going to be mistakes. And in my case, some of the people that I latched onto were people who were very dangerous, who could have ruined me. And I think that it's really important to talk about that because typically when you hear a wrongful conviction narrative, you hear about, the person gets arrested, they go to jail, they're on trial, they get out, they have their first hamburger after they get out of prison, the end of story. And I would argue that it's really right in that moment that their story truly begins. And it's a story that is going to come face to face with a lot of obstacles, not least of which the fact that when you've been accused of a heinous crime or when you've been vilified in a specific way as a woman, that's the stigma of that doesn't go away. Just because you've proven that it's not true or that you've proven that you're innocent does not mean that you are not going to be spending the rest of your life explaining yourself to other people and, in a way, proving yourself over and over and over again. And so I think wrestling with that reality was something that was deeply important for me to portray. Wrestling with the reality of the fact that now my identity is wrapped up with the death of my roommate and my friend, and how do I make sense of that from a place of like survivor's guilt. And then on top of that, trying to understand the why of it all. Why did this person vilify me in this very specific way as this sexually depraved monster? And by someone, I mean, why did my prosecutor do this? And that led me to reach out to my prosecutor and develop a relationship in order to try to understand why that happened and see if any kind of reconciliation would be possible.
That's interesting that you mentioned the prosecutor, because I definitely wanted to dive into that. You had to defend yourself significantly throughout this experience, and the reaching out to your prosecutor part is powerful to me. It's almost like going straight to the adversary and saying, "Why are you doing this? What's happening? Who are you as a person?" And you've mentioned that one of your goals was to try to understand him, who was the source of the slander. Not that I would compare the two, but we've often seen this with everyone's been a high school kid at some point or a school kid. And if someone's spreading a rumor about you, you often want to go and understand, why is this person saying this about me? What's their
Right.
motivation? What's their drive for doing this? You said you had started seeing your prosecutor as a human being and not a boogeyman throughout this process.
Yes.
And you empathized with where he was standing. Why is
Yeah.
that? Why is it important to confront an adversary like that? Because that's pretty brave, really.
Yeah. I mean, why would I do that? Because certainly people in my life thought that it was crazy. Certain family members were like, "Do you have Stockholm syndrome or something? Like, have you fallen in love with the person who hurt you for some like, what is going on there psychologically?" And I think part of it was that when I was on trial and in prison and all of that, I had only ever encountered this adversary in this adversarial system in which he was sort of positioned to be in opposition to me and to deny any interpretation of the facts that was in my favor. And so as a result, I felt like he was, just by virtue of his position, was incapable of evaluating me objectively. He was very, very biased in favor of seeing guilt in me and finding fault in me. And I wondered if he were to encounter me in a non-adversarial environment, if he wouldn't have a different view, and if he wouldn't change his mind, and if he wouldn't realize that in his pursuit for justice, he had committed injustice. And part of that was because I really hoped and believed that I could just convince him. And another part of it was because I did not want to commit the same kind of mistake towards him that others had committed towards me, which was to, again, assume fault, never give the benefit of the doubt, and to imagine, sort of build this person up into a boogeyman in my mind. Like, I recognize that people built me up to be a boogeyman in their mind. Like, that was the projection, the woman hating slut whore is a boogeyman in people's minds. And that was not who I really was. And so I did not want to commit the same kind of mistake and just assume that this, man of the law was really conniving and with full intention putting an innocent person behind bars who he knew to be innocent. And instead, I really wanted to understand why this had happened to me. Also, because at this point in my life, I had also met other wrongly convicted people who had been through similar experiences. And the vast majority of the time, it wasn't because prosecutors and police officers were knowingly framing an innocent person. They really genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. And then the question becomes, well, why do people believe they are doing the right thing, even in light of exonerating evidence, right? Like, even in light of proof of this person's innocence, how have they sort of twisted the facts in their minds to be interpreted as guilt when an actually objective viewpoint would have made them realize, oh, wait, no, this person is innocent? That I was interested in, also for the sake of just understanding how wrongful convictions happen, and in attempts to reach a place of like having a genuine impact on the world. If you're going to change the criminal justice system for the better, you need to know how it's not working and why it's not working. And so getting into the mind of my prosecutor was an attempt to do just that, to understand how justice goes awry, even when everyone has the best of intentions. And so arriving at a conversation with my prosecutor, asserting benefit of the doubt, asserting that he had good intentions, I then was able to begin a conversation with him, first of all, just about each other as people, not sort of putting him immediately on the spot to explain himself when it came to the trial, but instead to reveal myself in my openness to him, but also as a result, be a witness to whatever he was willing to reveal to me. And I find that people can't help but reveal themselves to you if you give them the space to do so. And
It's
so
powerful.
yes,
Mhm.
and by give them the space to do so, I mean not stand in a place of judgment, but stand in a place of compassion and curiosity. And I found that the more I learned about my prosecutor, the more I naturally just felt compassion for him, because the more you know a person in all of their facets of humanity, at least I feel that I cannot but help but feel compassion for them and empathy for them, pity for them. Like, instead of sort of anger transforms into pity, and so that, which isn't to say that I still don't get mad, I do. But like, in terms of my prosecutor eventually recognizing that he had vilified me and it was very unfair, like, he told me, "I'm sorry for having done that, and I realized that you are not the person that I thought I was prosecuting."
Wow.
So,
That's really powerful to come to that realization with somebody, and especially to see the point that you brought up of seeing this person as a human being and what their motivations are, and maybe what the story he was telling himself as to why he had to frame a case this way. Really, really fascinating.
mhm.
And also kudos to you for doing that, because I don't know that everybody would want to do that.
Right, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend to everyone
Yeah.
to do what I did. I found that I have the right kind of temperament to sit in a place of paradox. And the place of paradox that I find myself in with my prosecutor is allowing myself to, on the one hand, just accept him for who he is and where he is at, and but also recognizing that he has, in terms of how he could make up for what he did, he has not done that. As my mom said, too little, too late, not good enough, you know, and you can view it that way, or you can view it as, here is a person who is on a journey and he has made progress on his journey, and I can show up for that. I have the temperament who can show up and in a way accompany him on a journey, and where he may not arrive at the destination that I think he should arrive at. But I'm okay, because I know that on my journey, I am absolutely showing up where I need to be. And that sort of reframed it all for me, so that I realized that, like, of the two of us in the situation, I had always felt like obviously my reputation was destroyed by him and my well-being was destroyed by him. And so I had this idea in my mind that my well-being depended upon him. And now it's sort of flipped. And I know that my well-being doesn't depend on him, but weirdly, his well-being a little bit depends on me. And that's an interesting place for me to arrive at as a victim of his, his mistakes. I do think, though, that like in the process of building bridges where people might not otherwise build them for the sake of like unraveling these narratives that people build up about you, showing up as the person you really are instead of as the person they expect you to be. I think that's an aspect of it. There absolutely needs to be boundaries set, right? Like, women who have been victimized are victimized sometimes by people who very intentionally harmed you and who shouldn't be given the benefit of the doubt. And as a result of that, I think each person's situation should be calculated very carefully. And you should ask yourself, as a woman who is vilified, what do I need to do to accept that this is my reality? How does this inform me moving forward? How does this propel me forward into becoming the person that I want and should be? And does that involve any kind of direct confrontation with my adversary? I think it is interesting and valuable to approach an adversary because it does position them into having to defend what they're putting out into the world instead of just accepting it for what it is. And some people are once they've been sort of confronted with their own crimes as viewed in a certain kind of light, don't really know what to make of it and then have to sort of reframe themselves. And other people just dig in their heels and potentially perpetuate more harm. So I think it's really evaluating the circumstances for what they are, recognizing what does this thing that you've gone through, how does this inform who you are and elevate you as you continue to do work and be a person in the world.
That's interesting that you say that because you had to confront the term Foxy Noxy quite a bit,
Yes.
which was a story and a persona. You've called it a fable in other conversations that I've heard to the rest of the world about who you really are.
Mm-hmm.
And you did realize in your journey that that person actually didn't exist, and you described it
Right.
as a figment of others' imaginations, which I thought was really interesting and very true.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to arrive at that conclusion? What did it feel like when you did?
That's a great question. I think one of the silver linings of my story is the crimes that I was accused of and the person that I was being accused of being were so outrageous and so not who I was that there was never any like confusion on my part about who I really was. I at no point ever sort of had any kind of feelings of guilt about the Foxy Noxy or the Luciferina at all of it all, because that person really didn't exist. It was absolutely a figment of other people's imagination. I think the thing that I've had more trouble grappling with is the blame for my own wrongful conviction. So I think a lot of wrongly convicted people experience this, but I think that it's very similar to victim blaming in sexual assault cases, where people will say, well, you wouldn't have been sexually assaulted had you not been wearing those clothes, or had you not, went out for drinks, or had you not walked home alone. Like, there are all of these ways that we judge and find women at fault for their own victimizations. For someone else, some man's decision to commit a crime suddenly becomes at fault of the woman who is the victim of it. And I absolutely experienced that. And when it came to, even after I was acquitted and released from prison, there was this ongoing narrative that I was at fault for my own wrongful conviction, that it was because of my behavior or because of the facial expressions that I made in court, because I wore this shirt to school, to court one day. That was the reason I got wrongly convicted, and not the fact that, not the people who had actually tried to put me in prison and were responsible for, constructing this false narrative about me. And I had a really hard time, especially because I was faulted for the result of my interrogation. People said that, I falsely implicated an innocent man, and as a result of that, everyone knew that I was involved somehow or guilty somehow without really understanding what it is like to be put through a police interrogation and denying the fact that my human rights were violated. Like, I even blamed myself for a long time for the result of that interrogation. I could not explain it because it was the one time in my life where I was gaslit to the extent that I did not know what was true or not anymore, and I felt utterly insane, and I was at the mercy of the police officers who were suggesting this narrative to me. And it wasn't until a professor of psychology who specializes in police interrogations and false confessions, until he sort of showed me what actually happened, and that I realized that the result of that interrogation was absolutely not my fault. And so it took a while, and it took some educating on the specific circumstances of my ordeal for me to recognize that I was not at fault for my own wrongful conviction. And in fact, I think we fault people for being victims because it comes at a cost to the rest of us to recognize that we are all implicated in how this person was vilified and victimized. All the people who read the headlines about Foxy Knoxy are implicated in its ongoing, consumption and if the Foxy Knoxy murder orgy narrative had not triggered so many clicks, maybe that narrative might not have taken hold.
Exactly. We talked about this on our panel at the UN, how forwarding these kinds of images or any news articles with that name perpetuates the culture. Andrea Powell called it a culture of harm, basically.
I've interviewed women who have been victims of sexual assault, like, people who are very clearly, sodomized when they were 13 years old, and they talk about how the media's treatment of them in the aftermath was worse than the actual assault. And that should really give us pause, because you can go to jail for 50 years for sexually assaulting a 13-year-old, but no one spends a day in prison for abusing a person in the media by putting out sexually explicit imagery or false narratives. So I think that that's something that should give everyone pause and should result in I think a reckoning with, again, the question of, are these narratives and are these images actually in the public interest, or are they merely being used as a smokescreen to distract the conversation away from what is really in the public interest?
In terms of wrongful convictions, you've done a lot to tell stories of others who've been through this, because when we hear stories about prison or police interrogations, especially in the US, it's starting to get this way in Europe. When I was living in Germany for a couple of years, the true crime shows are on the rise there as well. But there's this almost Hollywood-like image of what prison or these experiences are like. And you've examined a lot of what leads to wrongful convictions, and a huge part of that is media playing a role in driving the characterization of the defendant in many cases. How do we control those?
The controlling of it all is a bit hard, because that requires you to question the very economics of media at this point, which I think media professionals are all in a state of crisis and also in a state of reckoning. Like, what is the content that we are creating and what is it for? And because the economics of it put the media professionals in the position of having to create content that captures people's attention, as opposed to creating content that informs people. Those are not necessarily the same things. And it is always weighing in favor of capturing attention, because that's how the money works. That is where the economics of media is in a crisis, and we should try to imagine alternate ways of positioning media so that the informing the public becomes once again its primary goal instead of capturing attention. And that's, I mean, as soon as we have TikTok and AI and social media, like all of that is complicated, and just the flood of free content that is out there, and the politicizing of content so that people feel like if they're on different political poles, they are just what is even considered a fact is now under question. So like all of that is a huge issue to untangle. When it comes, one thing that I want to mention, though, as we are discussing wrongful convictions, and particularly we're talking about how women are experiencing this kind of thing, I would be remiss not to talk about how women are wrongly convicted. I was not convicted in the typical way that women are convicted, or at least I was, in the sense that like women are typically vilified through character assassination as opposed to through a sober examination of the facts. Women, as opposed to men who are wrongly convicted, are by far overwhelmingly convicted of crimes that never happened. So
Yeah.
I was convicted of a crime that very actually happened. It just happened to be committed by a man, and I was accused of this man's crime. That is very rare when in the world of women who get wrongly convicted. That's more typical of a man's conviction. Women are convicted the majority of the time when someone that they love or who is in their care dies or is harmed, and this sort of assumption immediately falls on the woman who was the loved one or the caretaker of this person is at fault for whatever harm this person received, as opposed to it might have just happened randomly, or they might have had an undiagnosed illness, or this person might have committed suicide. Like there's this assumption that women are at fault for tragedies that occur to people who are in their care, or who they love, a lot of times their children. And there is a hysteria around women who are accused of, again, particularly crimes against their own children. Again, in the vast majority of these cases, no crime ever in fact happened. And these women are just vilified. So no crime happened. And so there's no evidence of a crime happening. It is instead a reevaluation of the facts in a certain light to say, oh, the woman didn't grieve in the proper way, or, like that. I can't tell you the number of times that it's really just comes down to that. They didn't think the woman was expressing the right kind of emotion in response to discovering that the person that they were caring for and loved was gone, had died, and therefore they must have done something wrong. And then, all of the facts of the case become reinterpreted in light of that assumption of guilt. That is what happens to the majority of women who are wrongly convicted in this country as well as all over the world. And how do you combat that? Because in a lot of men's cases, typically what happens is, someone is raped and murdered and they got the wrong person, but then they have DNA and they prove who actually did it. And so they prove that the original person who was convicted is not guilty. And that's how they are released from prison. That is not the case when it comes to women's cases. It really comes down to, do you think this person acted guilty or not? And there is no DNA to test that would prove someone's innocence. So it really comes down to, can you prove that maybe this died of a natural cause? And even then it's like sketchy because it's so much up to interpretation. So again, I feel like the danger that women are in because of how we are viewed through how we present ourselves to the world, and how we can be interpreted in the worst possible light on the flip of a dime, means that we are constantly sort of on ground that is very shifty, and are having to regain our balance in a world that wants to see us fall. And I think that one of the best ways that we can confront that is by supporting each other and holding on to each other to hold us up when the world is shifting underneath us.
Absolutely. That's another reason why we convened the UN panel of several women who were lawyers, a venture capitalist, a politician who had had this image-based sexual violence perpetrated against them. And it's our attempt to lift their voices and say, this could happen to anyone. And if it does, you're not alone. Here's what you can do.
Right.
One of the accusations you've faced in writing your books is that you were, quote unquote, capitalizing on your tragedy, as if a person would do that just to sell books. I think that would be something significant to go through for the purpose of writing books. But your books have presented to the world not only your authentic voice and who you are and the true characterization of who Amanda Knox is, but also many important learnings and life lessons from that and guidance.
Hmm.
So, what can others learn from your decision to write your books and in the process really take back your own story by doing so?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the huge takeaways of and one of the huge messages of my story that as I have delivered it in a book is is the process of like narrative identity and how much our narrative identity is important to our sense of who we are and our well-being, and how do we embrace life as it is instead of the life that we should be living, and then once we have embraced life as it is, envision ourselves and the best version of ourselves within that reality as it is, which includes all of the harm and trauma that we have sustained. So I'm hoping that by talking about what I have gone through, I am going to help other people who have been through traumatic experiences feel seen, give them an example of how one can move through trauma and by going through it, arrive at the other side in a place of empowerment. And then, of course, shed light on issues around, what's going on in the media, how are women vilified in the media. I talk about other women that I've made connections with. I call them the sisterhood of ill repute, women who have been, again, vilified, especially through their sexuality, diminished as human beings, and framed as those to take the blame of any kind of scandal that should arise. And so I believe that my story is very powerful and valuable for that reason. But beyond that, just to go back to your point of this accusation of capitalizing off of my tragedy, I think it's really, really telling that, well, first of all, I think the actual accusation that people pose to me is that I'm not capitalizing off of my tragedy, but that I'm capitalizing off of someone else's. So, in a lot of people's minds, there was only one true victim in the story that enveloped so many lives, and that was my roommate Meredith, who at 21 years old was studying abroad in Perugia, Italy, came home one night and was raped and murdered in her own bedroom. Horrific tragedy, and it absolutely is a valuable and horrible story and a tragedy that belongs to this family. The thing that I push back against is that in a story that then had ripple effects and implicated, had effects in a lot of other people's lives, that there can only be one true victim. Yeah, there are absolutely other victims who have resulted from the aftershock of what happened to Meredith. And that includes me, that includes my boyfriend Raffaele, that includes my boss Patrick Lumumba. And I think that anyone is entitled, especially victims are entitled, to tell their story and to reap any benefit that may come from telling their story. I do think that there is a particular resistance towards me, and I think that is in part due to the fact that I am a woman and people do, I think, I think people find reasons to find fault in vilified women, even as they find themselves uplifted, because they keep wanting to diminish that woman who has already been diminished and keep them tightly bound in that little box that they have contained them in. But beyond that, I like to sort of present to people the fact that you do not hear that kind of resistance to personal growth and personal fulfillment and personal enrichment from trauma when you talk about other, wrongfully convicted people's stories. Like a great example is, the Central Park Five, for instance,
Yes.
who are now the exonerated five. All of them have greatly benefited from the telling of their story, both personally and socially, and enriching themselves in the process, which is absolutely their due after everything that they've gone through, 100%. And you do not hear people saying to them, "Oh, you're capitalizing off of the horrific rape of this woman that happened in Central Park," because people recognize that she was a victim and they were a victim. And there seems to be this resistance to recognizing me as a victim because of what I call the single victim fallacy, which is this idea that there can only be one true victim in any kind of tragic story, which is clearly illogical and unfair, but it's an ongoing aspect of my experience that is meant to harm and diminish me, and I just refuse to allow it to.
Good for you, because it also affects families, right? After our panel, I remember Susanna's son, young guy, coming up to me and giving me a hug and saying, "Thank you for doing this with my mom." And that was one of the gut punch moments that I had, apart from everything, where I thought, this woman's children are living with this in their own community. They go to school, it's surrounding them all the time. And I know you've talked about the effect this has had on your family and the family that you've now created, and your children as well. But what are your concerns about that in terms of your story affecting your children?
Yeah, because you're absolutely right. Like, it doesn't just happen to the person who happens to be the epicenter of that, whatever tragedy takes hold. I have three younger sisters who all had to grow up in the midst of their sister being sexualized and vilified and turned into this monster in the public imagination. And all of them were negatively psychologically impacted by that experience, not least of which because, they grew up in an environment where my entire family had to put aside every other, aspect of their lives in order to save me. Like, that became, everyone in my family was, everything turned into save Amanda, save Amanda. And then when it comes to thinking about my own children, right? Like, the minute that I got pregnant, I felt a sudden sense of urgency to get a grip on this ongoing trauma that was both internal and external. There was the external blaming and, continual blaming and victim blaming and vilifying of me. But then there was also the internal grappling with the psychological trauma of that. And at the time that I got pregnant, I still very much felt like I was living under this like dark cloud of this worst experience of my life. I was like Eeyore with with it just sort of like constantly raining down on me. And the last thing that I wanted in giving birth was to sort of spread that cloud over onto someone else. And then, the second that my daughter was born, the first thing that I said to her as she was screaming from the pain of having been birthed was, "I'm sorry," because I recognized in that instant that she was going to experience pain in her life that I could not protect her from and that I could not take from her onto myself. And my own mom was in the room at that, with me as I gave birth. And I realized that that is how my mom felt the entire time that I was going through my trials and imprisonment. And she would have traded places with me in an instant if she could, but she couldn't. But what she did do is she was there for me in any physical and psychological way possible that she could. She is in large part a huge reason why I am sane today, why a lot of people look at me and say, "Wow, you've really landed on your feet after this terrible ordeal." And it's like, well, my mom was there for me the whole time. She knew I was innocent. She fought for me. She would do anything for me. And in that way, she really reaffirmed for me that my life had value, that I had value, even if the whole world was telling me that I didn't. My mom was there reaffirming that I did. And I can do that for my children. I can show them rather than tell them that they have value, and also that if they if and when they do experience pain in their life, they can come out on the other side not diminished, but informed and uplifted by it.
How are you teaching your children how to deal with this, or how do you plan to help them
Yeah, because
navigate
they're
this?
at a young age. So thankfully, none of them are on social media at this time. My daughter is 3 and my son is 1. But I have thought about this because, they're paying attention to me and their father, and we have social media, we have phones, we are engaging with the world of information. And I think that first and foremost, we have to, before we start talking to them about their practice, we need to be models of a good practice of really treating all of these things as a tool instead of being used as a tool by these things. I think that the danger and recognizing the value of our attention. I think people do not recognize the value of their attention, but the people who are trying to capture their attention on all of these apps and all of that, they absolutely know the value of our attention, and they are constantly trying to capture it. So I think guarding preciously and doling out responsibly our attention as a limited, precious resource is ultimately the best practice possible. And really putting these apps and these technologies, remembering that they are tools for our benefit instead of we are tools for their benefit. And that, I think that's really just reinforcing for them the idea of the value of our attention. I think above all else, that is the most important thing, because you can talk to kids about self-image and well-being and, uh, the dangers of putting stock into what other people think and blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, it all comes down to what are we paying attention to and why? And are we even aware that we are paying attention to the things that we are paying attention to? And I think that's where the danger of these like false narratives around women, they slip in when people are not paying attention to what they're paying attention to. They're just casually absorbing the stories and the narratives and the images that are just being thrust in their direction.
Very true. Absolutely. One of the reasons I created this podcast from the beginning was for awareness around stories. And there's a tradition that I ask all guests a certain question. Before I do, is there anything I should have asked you about in this context that I have not?
No, this was great. Had a great time. Yeah.
Wonderful. So that brings us to the famous closing question. Tell us about a narrative you've challenged lately and why.
So one, this is going to sound really silly, but in my daughter watches Disney shows and stuff like that, and one narrative that I find popping up over and over and again is this idea of the good guy and the bad guy.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very pervasive narrative that really just underlies a black and white narrative of reality that I think is dangerous because it's not very representative of reality. I think reality is more complicated than just villains and victims and nobody in between. And so when my daughter loves stories, and when I tell her stories, I always try to tell her stories that are not about bad guys and good guys. It's more about characters who become lost in some kind of way and then have by the force of will or by some kind of friend, a person coming into their life finding their way again, and sort of challenging that idea that the only story worth telling is a story about a bad guy.
That's funny. We actually did an initial episode in the pilot season of this. that I shot with my editor, we actually had an episode on good guy versus bad guy narratives and how pervasive they were and how they've pretty much fueled everywhere. And they've become the source of why we go to war with countries and why certain politicians are better over others. And it's really just they literally are everywhere. But I love the idea of telling children a different, more nuanced story of how people learn how to cooperate with each other. That's probably the better way to go. But I do want to say thank you very much for joining me and taking the time to join me. I know you're busy with the book experiences that you're now having and all the impact that it's having. And congratulations on that, really, for your voice and everything, and for joining me today, Amanda. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me.